part 2 of the Ian Masters July 3, 2018 interview. In this interview we hear the conversation turned toward Trump's close ties to the Russian oligarchs. Some of the ideas visited here include Trump's support among the Tea Party, evangelicals, oligarchs, Fox News followers. In terms of the Fox News bubble, has Fox become the de facto voice of the Republican Party, and as such a conduit of the Russian oligarchy and Putin via President Trump? It's also worthwhile to listen closely to these key words: attack, constitutional convention, evangelicals, Mueller, Pearl Harbor, Putin, racism, treason, Trump Tower meeting. Make up your own mind. There's plenty here to cause concern with the direction of the United States political system on this eve of the 4th of July, 2018.
It's almost like he's taking his cues from Putin, if not his orders from Putin, because suddenly before the G7, knowing in advance that the Brits want a resolution against Russia, Trump suddenly he changes the subject and stymies the Brits by saying, let's talk about bringing Russia back into the G7.
Well, I think by now I would assume he has a back channel. What we saw in 2016, that the Russians were surprised he did so well in the Republican primary, and then they were desperate, that he really could be president. They needed a direct connection. They didn't want it to go through proxies, which was, Russian criminals or businessmen and the rest of it. In fact, at that meeting in Trump Tower, a staff KGB officer accompanied the Russian lawyer. It ultimately went no well, but the reason Jared Kushner wanted to set up a back channel with the Russians is because he knows that the National Security Agency has copies of all conversations that go across its channels, like the hotline that goes between the Kremlin and the White House. So they didn't want any recordings, what agreements were made. But by now, so many of Trump's meetings are held in Mar-a-Lago, away from any Secret Service rosters or the rest of it. It just all looks like, suggests that he's got a back channel. And, you look at the chronology of these events, like the G7 meeting, and you really have to wonder. He's just simply indifferent, by the way, what we think. He just sort of writes it off as fake news. And, if he were caught red-handed, he would write that off as fake news as well. But if he continues to support Putin against Europe and takes down the Atlantic Alliance, which is we're well on the way, then we'll know, won't we?
Well, in the last meeting that he had with Putin, and first of all, there was nobody allowed in. There were no note takers. The Russians said that they didn't want Fiona Hill, the NSC, the National Security Council specialist on Russia, in the meeting. She speaks Russian. So Trump basically adhered to the Russian request, which is beyond belief. And there were no note takers. And so nobody knows what went on in that meeting. And I'm sure the same will be true in the July 16th meeting in Helsinki between Trump and Putin. There will be nobody in there. There'll be no official record. And that in itself is unprecedented, isn't it?
Well, terrifying our allies in NATO, yes, absolutely. I mean, the Europeans don't trust him. Obviously they don't, and they wonder about his relations with Russia and the fact that he's not going to have no note takers. They're going to come out with no, any sort of truthful statement after the meeting. And Putin is biding his time because he knows that Trump's going to bring this around, even if it means sacrificing the rest of the world, the rest of our alliances. So really with Trump, you have to look at his actions. He had his chance to go back on Russia after the attack on Skripal, the Russian intelligence officer in Salisbury, which was an act of war using a biochemical weapon against an ally. And the fact that the Russians have not come clean on that, have not come clean on the meddling in the U.S. elections or shooting down the Malay airline, and we go on, and yet you're having a summit. That doesn't happen in international relations unless there's something very dirty going on, suspicious.
And we're going to take a brief station break. We'll be back continuing the discussion with Robert Baer on the eve of this 4th of July.
From Russia with love, I fly to you, much wiser since my goodbye to you. I've traveled the world.
Leave it till tomorrow to unpack my case. Honey, disconnect the phone. I'm back in the USSR. You don't know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR. Well, the dirty red girls really knocked me out. Leave the West behind. And my little girls make me sing and shout.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And on the eve of this 4th of July, we are continuing the conversation with Robert Baer, one of the most accomplished agents in CIA history, the winner of the Career Intelligence Medal. He's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, including See No Evil and Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Soul for Saudi Crude. And he's considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Middle East and is the current national security affairs analyst for CNN. And his latest book is The Perfect Kill, 21 Laws for Assassinations. So my understanding is that the deal between Putin and Trump was sealed in November of 2013 at the Nobu restaurant in Moscow. This was a meeting at which all of the top Russian oligarchs showed up, but not Vladimir Putin, who Trump had really wanted to meet with, and Putin at the last minute had a diplomatic engagement he had to go to. But he sent along essentially all of the top oligarchs who Putin regulates. He's like the capo di capo. He's the boss of the bosses. And so he, apparently at that meeting, which was preceded by what happened later in the Ritz-Root Hotel with the young Russian ladies doing all kinds of strange things to Trump on the bed that President Obama had slept in the presidential suite in Moscow. But that aside, at this dinner that preceded that evening of cavorting young Russian women, my understanding is that all of these oligarchs who, and of course Trump is a wannabe billionaire. He wants to be a billionaire and acts like a billionaire and lies about the fact that he's a billionaire and exaggerates his wealth and begs Forbes to put him on their lists. So here he is sitting around with a bunch of incredibly wealthy Russians who basically run the whole country along with Putin. And if a young woman dies in the swimming pool in one of their mansions, it just disappears and never appears in the press. They have absolute authority, and they're above the law. And their world vision was apparently inculcated into Trump. And then as soon as he got back to the United States, Trump began his campaign against President Obama by attacking him as a Kenyan, as not having a birth certificate, etc. And a lot of people wondered what the hell that was about. Well, in retrospect, what it looks like it was about was that Trump was fulfilling Putin's wishes, which was to damage the legitimacy and the presidency of Barack Obama, who Putin hated as much as he hated Hillary Clinton. And in doing this, what Trump actually effectively did was launching the birther conspiracy. He gave all of those people who subsequently voted for him in the last election permission to be racist again, and essentially coalesced this base that he has today. He brought them out of the woodwork, if you will. So that's my understanding, is that the Russians have been running this guy, and it didn't matter to them whether he won the presidency or not, because had he lost the presidency to Hillary Clinton, which most people expected, including, I imagine, Putin, Trump to this day would be having rallies around this country leading the chant, lock her up, lock her up.
Well, Ian, he's always come back from Moscow with a plan. I mean, an that supports the Russians, whether it's op-eds in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or when he first announced that he was going to run for president was after a visit to Moscow. So none of this is new. I mean, you have to look at, he's a failed property developer that's gone bankrupt multiple times. It's Russian money that has bailed him out, including selling his mansion in Florida. And that all these people, all these investors that live in Moscow or even Brighton Beach or Miami are instruments of the Russian state. It's in the FBI, it's called the long tail. If you're a mobster, a Russian mobster, or something like Felix Sater, living in Brooklyn, but you've got business in Russia, you simply have to report to the KGB who you're dealing with, where your money's going. And let's not forget, in 1991, billions upon billions of dollars were stolen from the Communist Party, laundered through New York, through KGB agents, mobs, Russian mobsters, and Trump was the beneficiary of that. I mean, since we can't see his taxes since he won't release them, we simply don't know what would happen if the Russians simply said, pull out. Everybody, all you Russians, sell your stuff. I would imagine his property empire would completely collapse. So he is dependent upon Russian money. And he's always, since the mid-'80s, gone back to Moscow for direction. He doesn't have an original political thought in his head, but just reads the tea leaves, what the Russians want, what's a populist issue. And the amazing thing about this is, and I have a lot of respect for the Russians, their minds, and their political minds as well. Let's not forget that they were in the middle of Brexit. It was a populist issue. They understood where the dividing lines were, and they knew how to exploit them, and probably put money into that as well, into Brexit. But this guy, Aaron Banks. So, the Russians have pulled off against Britain and the United States the most damaging act of political sabotage since Germany sent Lenin back to Russia.
So surely, though, with Trump's long history of involvement with Russian gangsters and with New York gangsters as well in his real estate developments, and of course the Michael Cohen's cache of information might well support a lot of this, but I think it's a safe assumption, surely, that the FBI has really, really deep and long-standing files on this guy, and I imagine other intelligence agencies do. So what happens if he's able to shut down the Mueller investigation? Or I guess another question would be, do you think Mueller has all this? He surely must have it. He may even have the tax returns. Let's start with that. What do you think's going on there?
Well, Ian, the problem is that Trump and the KGB operate in a gray area. And since he doesn't take any money from the Russian state and has no secrets, at least before he was president, he can talk to people. I mean, I can talk to Russians, you can talk to them now, but since neither of us have any secrets or intend to take any money, it doesn't fall within the within the FBI's purview. And don't forget that in 1991, on George H.W. Bush's watch, both the FBI and the CIA were told the Soviet Union is gone. Do not waste your time. The Russian counterintelligence section in New York City was handed over to the people who do the Italian mobsters who knew nothing about Russia. So all they were looking at, they weren't looking for a KGB or a Russian government hand, or did they consider the Russian mobsters instruments of the Russian state. So we stopped paying attention. We had defeated the evil empire. Clinton didn't do any better. I mean, remember, I was in the CIA then, and I got messages saying there's not a penny for you people to go after and recruit Russians or develop them. You couldn't even get a cup of tea to be paid for by CIA headquarters to go after Russians. I was there. I saw it. It closed down. We didn't care about Russia, and that went on essentially for the last 2 decades. We did not think they were a serious enemy. And so as they're pouring money, the Russian government, into Trump Soho,